The lecture on the subject is going to be delivered by Professor Subrata Mitra. The subject is Rebels into Stakeholders, the Regional Governance and Resilience of the State in India. We are told that we have 35 minutes for the speaker, 5 minutes for the chairperson, which I would happily forego, and 10 minutes for question and answer. So, to you, Professor Mitra. Professor Mitra, at 30 minutes, I'll just indicate to you that you have 5 more minutes to go.
Distinguished Chair, fellow participants, ladies and gentlemen, most of you, I'm sure, are experienced conference goers and presenters. You must therefore understand how it feels to come at the end of a tiring day, which has followed 2 other tiring days. We have reached a point of conference saturation where the diminishing marginal utility of presentations is clear. Everything that is important has already been said, and I have an uncomfortable feeling that I'm standing between you and dinner. This is a problem, and I have decided to do like the Chinese, to turn a problem into an opportunity, which is to leave behind the text I've come with, add to it the exceedingly interesting conversations that have taken place over the past 3 days, and instead of looking back to 1991 when ADRI was set up and thinking about what has happened since, I am preparing now for the Golden Jubilee. I will most probably not be around, but some of you will be around, and I'm now thinking about what you would say then in terms of what we are talking about now. I say this because the theme I've chosen for my paper is much discussed, almost banalized. And yet, I want to add to it a method which will help us set up an empirical agenda which will liberate us of the passive subjecthood of important concepts and give back the sovereignty to the researcher so that we can connect society, development, and knowledge, which is what ADRI is about. The problem that I'm talking about is, as I said, a banal problem. Why is India a resilient democracy? Why has India not lived up to the pessimistic prognosis of the likes of Selig Harrison or Huntington or many others who said India would balkanize? The most elegant way I've heard it formulated is by W.H. Morris Jones, who was the advisor to the last Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, and the founder of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in London. Morris said in his Politics in India, quoting Galileo, a puracy mover, that he's looking at the universe and thinking of the impossibility that the thing will hold. And he says, it still moves. India still holds together. That's the banal question, to which I would add a couple of points which I hope will make it more interesting than we normally think this question to be, particularly in cross-cultural comparison. As we heard from Ashutosh Bashma yesterday, India is a member of a very small minority of post-colonial states and to have survived. Why is that the case? In the old days, this used to be described, I've forgotten the name of the American political scientist who formulated it. He says, why does India work? Why does democracy work? It is the third-class railway syndrome. The generation of young people here don't know what third classes are. When I was young, there used to be third class in trains. So the train would pull to the platform and there would be a spot where the third class compartment will stop. That would be the most crowded and people would be pushing and jostling, and the compartment itself would be choke full. With difficulty, the door would open, a few people get out, and they will be pushing and jostling. And some will get in, the train will pull out. What happens next? Those who are pushing and jostling, as soon as they're in, turn around and become the gatekeepers at the next station. Those who are left behind have seen a few people getting in. So instead of going to beat up the station master and burn the station, they wait for the next train to come, and trains keep coming. That was the explanation of how elections, local, regional, national, bring in those pushers who then become elites and keep the show going. That there is an elevator which brings up the bottom, the Gaon Ka Neta, bottom of the pyramid, and on the return trip brings down notables who were once important but have ceased to have their political function. And that elite circulation keeps India going. Those are the explanations. It became interesting when I looked at the prognosis of Atul Kohli from his very well-known book, Democracy and Discontent. As you can see, the broken lines are the trend. He looks at, there were two ways of measuring governance at the time. One was from Huntington, which is million of violent deaths per population, number of violent deaths per million. That was Huntington. Atul Kohli's was number of riots per million of people. So he looks at India, starts fairly well, and then becomes more and more disorderly in terms of number of riots. You can see a dip in 1975. That's the emergency, and it goes up again, from which he draws a trend line that India will become disorderly, living up to the predictions of most people. When I started my work with the same technique, with the same database, I found that in real terms, the prognosis didn't come true. India, instead of going up, the trend line dipped. So why did it happen that way? For that, I came up with a model, and this model takes the same old model of Huntington and Gare. These are people who had predicted that in a traditional society, when change comes, structural change disrupts the old patron-client relations, and expectations outstrip capacities. So a gap develops between what people want and what the state or the economy can give. That gap becomes the source of relative deprivation in Gare. That's why people rebel, and in Huntington, that's why institutions cannot any longer hold. And post-colonial democracies fall apart. They become, either they go into pieces or they become military dictatorships. Again, in the Indian case, the same old constitution still holds, with a little break of 18 months at the time of the emergency. The same old ramshackle democracy continues. Generational change has taken place. Political parties in power have gone away peacefully, others have come, and the show keeps going. So where does the old Huntington-Gare model doesn't work? What is new? There I have added, as you can see, between state and society, a new variable. These are the decision makers. If the decision makers who were once there, who have now gone up, understand what makes people want to rebel and do something about it, then instead of relative deprivation and conflict leading to disorder, new norms are created, and those norms keep politics orderly. And this is a dynamic model where new people come and it had to go on continuously. The package of policies that matter are law and order management, strategic reform, constitutional incorporation of values, and judicialization of dispute, leading to the creation of new norms where the judiciary itself acts as a continuous source of interpretation of the Constitution and creation of new rules of the game. That is roughly the model. It's a macro model, and the question which is most interesting for me is, why does it work? This is where I have to remember Susan Rudolph and a superb article called Imperialism of Categories, that you are told there is a democracy deficit, there is a liberal deficit, there is lack of inclusive development, and people go on to describe it. But why does it matter to people who are out there? That is why we have to go down to the level of the individual. My technique is to go from the macro to the micro, look at the individual reasoning, and then put it together. So I have devised a little game, and it looks complex, but it's actually very, very commonsensical. Every political transaction, any sort of transaction, requires two parties. Now, in this particular game, the two people could be an owner and a sharecropper, and they are engaged in a game of producing a harvest and sharing it out. I would assume that both know that the estimated product is a fixed sum, so that if you get more, I get less. They set up a sharing division pattern, and if both stick to the bargain, which is the top left corner, they obey the rule, both get their agreed share. For simplicity, I'm putting it at equality, each gets K. But each may be tempted to do better than that. You can disobey the rule by stealing or selling away the crop before it is ripe if you are the worker, or demanding from the worker things that the worker has not decided, like your wife should wash my dishes, your child should look after the cattle, and so on. That little additional is the key to what might happen. If you agree with the assumption that the game has a fixed payoff or fixed sum, then if on the left side is player 1, on the top is player 2, by convention, the sum on the left on each cell is what player number 1 gets, and the one on the right is what player number 2 gets. Think of what happens if the player number 1 does not obey and player 2 continues to obey. The player 1 gives himself or allows himself a little additional gain, which he knows and the other person knows must come from the share of the opponent or the adversary. And the same can be done by the other player too. Both may decide to cheat. If both cheat or break the rule, they end up in the bottom right corner where they are hoping to increase their share of the gain. Now that is not possible, because if you add up the share of the two individual players, it becomes more than the value of the game, which is not possible. Or in other words, the crops will not be cultivated properly, and both will get 0. And instead of an orderly game, there would be anarchy. That is the message of this two-person game. It's called a prisoner's dilemma situation, where both are acting unilaterally. So how do we get them from the bottom right to the top left, which is where governance is possible? I went back to the old contractuarians, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and I also remembered the earlier conversation about how to build a modern army through discipline and regular pay. That was Lord Desai's formulation. Simply ask yourselves, if there is a third player, the state, which says if you cheat, you die, punishment would be severe, then E becomes 0. Or if the state understands that hungry peasants will steal and increase the share of the peasant such a way that you will not have to steal just to keep alive, then you would see the point in obeying the rule. Or it might end up in a situation where the worker and the owner know that they are part of a corporate body which does the corporate policing, which bans the additional income from disobeying the rule. So the combination of punishment, enlightened self-interest, or corporate policing might keep the game in the top left where each obeys the rule. This will break down in one case, and there's nothing much that can be done about it, which is if the rule itself is offensive, that it violates your sense of the sacred, that you cannot wear a headdress when you go to a public school in France. If the rule itself is deeply offensive, that's where Professor Blair's argument about dignity comes in, then E becomes so important that breaking the rule becomes the preferred strategy. And that is where this kind of reasoning breaks down. So what can the state do? I'm suggesting that the state can do any one of these 6 things, or all of them. If it can do all of them, then the order will prevail. First is to have institutional arrangements based on the logic of federalism and constitutional forms of power sharing, where rebels become stakeholders, which is why I've chosen 3. Nitish Kumar's Bihar, Mamata Banerjee's West Bengal, and Manik Sarkar's Tripura. All opposition parties one time, and they have become, now they're inside the compartment holding on the others. So that's turning rebels into stakeholders, and elite recruitment I've already talked about, particularly very sophisticated systems of new elite creation, like 1/3 of members of every panchayat should be women, many ways of inducting scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and an informal quota system which brings in some Muslim representation. And then come other variables like law and order management. Please note, I talked earlier about the state punishing heavily if there is cheating, which is policing. But no state can have as many policemen and women as people. And if it does, who will police the police? So law and order management has to be ingrained as a habit, like German drivers know. You may cheat a little, but you'll lose a few points. So they start, when the light turns yellow or to orange, they automatically speed down, because the notion of law and order management has been ingrained. Then comes trust, social control, and strategic reform. Again, the example I have is the Californian drip irrigation. Not reform across the board, but exactly where it matters, that you identify the girl child as a very vulnerable section of society and build in reforms. So you take reform all the way exactly where it matters. The final one is sacralizing governance. If the core values as symbols of a society that, where contested, are constitutionally protected, then that reason for disobedience will disappear. Take the case of 1950s Tamil Madras. That's when Pakistan is going up in flame, Bhasha Andolan is growing, Sri Lanka is getting slowly paralyzed because of Sinhala only, and the Tamils discover, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Malayalam, that British colonial rule is over, the Hindi colonial rule is about to start, and we have to do something about it. So Tamil becomes good enough to kill or die for. No killing, not much killing there, basically to die for. And then something happens. So when the Chinese attack India or Indians attack China, as the Chinese claim, every Indian state tries to raise money, and the one raising most money is Tamil Nadu. What has happened in the meantime? The State Reorganization Commission has given the hegemonic position within newly constituted state to mother tongue. You will speak to the tax collector in the language in which you speak to your mother, and language then has ceased to be a good enough reason to disobey. I'm suggesting that India has survived because India has done a combination of all these variables. To test this model, I looked at a sample of Indian electorate, again from the CSDS data in 2004. And this data had several questions on perception of law and order, which I took as the measurement of governance, and I put in all the variables that belong to the model and did a multiple regression, where there are two kinds of variables. One is the context itself. Using a system of dummy variables, I could measure, other things being equal, does the fact of being in Bihar add to the perception of law and order positively or negatively? That's how I'm measuring the contribution of context. And then the other variables like trust and so on are measured. The ones that are of interest, I can't go into details here, is Bihar and West Bengal. Both have a very strong negative coefficient. Those are the states where just being Bihari or just being Bengali made out a cause for lower governance. I thought that would be the reason to pick up those two states. And Tripura was another state I selected for a very peculiar reason. I've been doing research on citizenship in India, measuring citizenship actually on the basis again of 4 questions, and ranking Indian states in terms of citizenship. Can you believe which came the lowest? It was not Kashmir. Kashmir was pretty low. The lowest was Tripura. And I was curious, what is the matter with Tripura? So I had to go to Tripura to discover that it was a basically tribal state. Come independence and partition, there's a wave of Bengali migration. So tribals start being pushed backwards and the migrants take up position in important jobs and professions. Then comes the Bangladesh Liberation War, another wave of migration, and tribals become a minority in their own state. Of course, a substate is created for them, but that still doesn't make them happy. So far as Bengalis are concerned, they are in Tripura. I've talked to them, but Tripura is only their temporary home. When it comes to looking for a girl or a boy for a suitable marriage, they're looking for someone from Dhaka or Murshidabad or Mymensingh. They're thinking about Bari, which is far away. This is only a temporary basha. So I thought Tripura would be another good state to pick up. So deliberately for this study, I picked up these 3 difficult states and expanded my model to include, as you can see in the bottom box, 3 more variables: federalization, which is giving more and more autonomy to states, and power sharing within the state, like we saw in the previous paper, where backwards come in and get a bigger chunk of power, and constitutional reform. So this then becomes the new model to test. Here the hypothesis is, if the state government does these things, the first 4 that we have seen and these other 3, then governance will follow. So I move on to see exactly which state is doing what. Let's first take Nitish Kumar's Bihar. There is reservation of seats for extremely backward classes and women in local panchayats, bicycle and meal programs, Sat Nishchay, 7 results, programs of Sushasari, good governance, included measures to improve road connectivity, drainage system, youth employment and skills development, clean drinking water, proper sanitation, electricity, access to higher education. These are the programs and volunteer-driven initiatives. Parcha Pe Charcha, Har Ghar Dastak, take the message of Nitish Kumar government to the voters and enable iterative sessions with the Chief Minister. The important thing is not just to have policies, but to signal. Only then, in the heart and mind of the actor out there, would be a desire to go back to the top left corner. So that you do something is necessary but not sufficient. So what does it produce? Look at the public service indicators. You have already seen them in the previous presentation. Percentage of population below poverty line has gone down. Health indicators have improved. Birth rates, infant mortality also has improved. Literacy has gone up. Ease of doing business has gone up from 21, rank 21 to 16. However, if you are looking at the consequences in terms of murder and riot, it's puzzling. Murders have declined. The red line is India as a whole. Bihar is the blue line. Above India, but it's coming down. And if you see the last week, coming down quite sharply, maybe if I were brave enough to do like Harry, have a prognosis, one day it will reach India, but at the moment it's still above India but declining. However, when it comes to riots, that's not the case. So whatever happened? These are things where I don't know. I'm still doing research. I've done a couple of good interviews during this conference. More about that when the question session comes. Let's look at West Bengal. All said and done, the Mamata government actually has understood the importance of dignity. So they're coming up with the slogan of Ma, Mati, O Manush, Mother, Land and Humanity, or guarantee of Parivartan, change, and symbolic gestures like return 400 acres of land to Shingur farmers, set up Gorkhaland Territorial Administration, then Juvashri scheme monthly dole of 1,500 rupees to unemployed youth, who I presume go on to support the Trinamool Congress, Kanyashri Prokolpo, direct cash transfer scheme for girls, increase in budget allocation for women's development and social welfare, Shobut Shati scheme distributes bicycles to students of class 9 and 11, 12 in all government affiliated schools. Then public service indicators like Bihar, percentage of population living below the poverty line has gone down, birth rate has improved, so has infant mortality rate, literacy rate has gone up. ADRI ranking, Human Development Indicator, has however gone down a little from 10 to 11. Ease of doing business has gone down from 11 to 15. Now let's look at the crime. Bengal, which was below India, has gone up in terms of murder. Violence in terms of riots had gone up. I think when the struggle was taking place between the CPM and the Trinamool for control of the local paras and panchayats, there was a time when riots were high. It has now gone down. Has it gone down because it's not recorded, or has it really gone down? That's where I need more research. My final example is Tripura. Policy initiatives, 37-point special package for development of scheduled tribes, who are a big chunk of the population. 37% reservation for scheduled tribes in government jobs, improved public services, efforts made to protect tribal languages and culture, government facilitated relocation of Jumia tribes in cluster villages. I will answer more questions on Tripura because I've done some field work there in terms of language and Kakporok and stuff like that. Then shortcomings in development, shortage of qualified teachers in tribal areas. You can build schools, but you can't necessarily put good teachers. High dropout rate among scheduled tribe schools, and large interstate disparities in components of HDI. Lack of employment opportunities for tribal youth in government or private sectors, and that sort of leads them towards militancy. What are the results? Public service indicators. Percentage of population below poverty line has come down. Health indicators have improved. Birth rate, infant mortality rate have also improved. Literacy has gone up to an astounding 87%. Ease of doing business has gone up from 26 to 22. Consequences. Murder, which was very high, has come down, still above Indian average, but the most spectacular is riots have spectacularly gone down. I'll now bring it on to a conclusion. My first conclusion is in terms of empirical research agendas, I would like a lot more fieldwork for people, especially if you're working on India. You're sitting on a gold mine in terms of detailed, in-depth research, particularly entering the inner world of the actor in terms of interviews and in terms of other qualitative methods, as well as quantitative methods. One of the nicest new method that has now come is a multi-method study of looking at variables in terms of quantitative, qualitative, and discursive measurements. My second argument is one I'll repeat, again going back to Susan Rudolph. Things, so large variables which are attributed to India, like fundamentalism, ethnicity, conflict, and fragmentation, a kind of orientalization of India, have political and not necessarily cultural and ethnic origins and are amenable to a general explanation. That's the kind of work Ashutosh Varshney does. What I'm trying to do here is to point research towards exactly those bits where things don't work. So if there is generally democracy or democratic resilience in India, then why does it not work always and everywhere? Where are the exceptions? Where are the counterfactuals? What kind of research can be done by going down to the level of the individual and looking up to see what he sees and then understand why did he go left and not right? And that's the kind of input that institutes like ADRI or my own institute can come up with, which can then help out the decision maker. And my main findings are rule of law is critically conditional on ability of modern institutions to accommodate traditional values, effective implementation of social and economic reform, balancing of force and co-option in the management of law and order, commitment of the state to individual rights, as well as respect for group rights as cornerstone of democracy rather than the derivation of legitimacy from some other predefined ideological, cultural, or religious essence. I think the message has gone all the way up, which is why more than Hindutva, we hear now the talk of Vikashbad. More than simply concentrating on a particular community, at least at the rhetorical level, the slogan is Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikash. The limitations of this kind of study, solid generalizations across these three states have not been possible for me so far. As I said, if you do the right things, right consequences should follow. Is that what is happening? I think individual states have their individuality, and area studies, even in the age of rampant cut on area studies and promotion of disciplines, will always have room. That one has to enter the deep structure and deep memory of individual states. So a general model like mine will probably have some explanatory value so far as causal variables are concerned, but when it comes to prediction, we will still need the area specialists. So the combination of disciplinary focus and area commitment is probably what we will need in terms of research agendas. Then purely endogenous solutions to governance are limited in explanatory power. My three arenas are federal states, and what the central government does or selectively chooses not to do will have an impact on what happens within the state, which is why one has to think of solutions not just at the state level, but also all India levels. Finally, changing nature of cognition in the era of identity politics. I'm thankful to Harry Blair, who already has made the point that roti, kapra, and makan are necessary but not sufficient. At the end of the day, izzat or dignity does matter. If there is something in you which you consider sacred, a point where you will not be touched without your own permission, and somebody does it, then, and you do nothing about it, then you can't be who you think you are in your own eyes. That is the stage where suicide terrorism comes in, and that's the kind of rhetoric we have heard from Bhutto in Pakistan saying, we will eat grass if necessary, but we'll fight India for 1,000 years. So That is the kind of variable that modern political science is not particularly good at coping with, because we are still driven by individual methodological individualism and expected utility maximization. How to tackle these new perceptual variables which are corporate in character is the big challenge for at least political science for the next generation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Mitra. That was a wonderfully clear and thought-provoking lecture. I have a few queries in my mind. One is the game theory as it came out seems a little too predictable, but as we all know, human beings, and especially in the three states that Professor Mitra has dealt with, are not always very predictable. There's an invisible fractious zone running under all these three states. And also, the people who lost these states, the party that lost these three precious states, is also creating another template right next door by development with injustice, by defining sabka saath who's sab, who matters more. And also the legalities, the laws are being used very slyly. The money bill is being used to change what could not be changed otherwise if it was put through the parliament. So the money bills are now proposing far-reaching changes in the Aadhaar card and the identity and the personal lives of the citizens, except that most citizens are not really aware of it. Something which the Supreme Court of India has ruled as voluntary is now being made compulsory, even to the extent that the children will need an Aadhaar card to get a hot midday meal. So that was my big worry. And now, having articulated that and got it off my head, I throw it open to the room for questions. We'll take them in bunches, I guess. Yes, the gentleman in checked shirt.
We have so much fragmentation in India, having multi-party system. But we find coherence in China having one-party system. Why?
Can you please ask just the question and not give a background? Yeah?
Only
take it that, you know.
Why we have fragmentation as multi-party system in India and coherence of one-party system in China?
Yes, anyone else? The lady at the back.
I really enjoyed that talk, thank you. It's very stimulating. My question is, could the model cope with an analysis of gender relations? For example, Professor Rao's comment on the complex mixture of love and fear that keeps women from explicitly pursuing autonomy. Given that the gender wage gap is so stable and so persistent globally.
Could you repeat the question? Professor Mitra would like you to be a little more explicit about what exactly you're pointing at.
Well, I'm not quite sure, it's an open question. Could the model be applied to gender relations, which means that you would have to unpack the prisoner dilemma, I guess, to acknowledge that the agents may have unequal power, that the agents may be tied together, for example, through the institution of marriage. So when I think about these things, I think about Professor Rao's work, where she talks about a complex mixture of love and fear that hold Indian women in a kind of tactful restriction of their assertion of autonomy, so that they preserve the status of the household and for this, rather than undermine a man's status. So she won't emphasise that she is earning money or that she's holding the household together, because it lowers his status, which lowers her status and exposes her to more violence. And I think it's significant because the gender wage gap exists globally in every society. It's very persistent, it's very difficult to shift. Does that make sense? Yes. Yes.
Gentleman at the back. Then we'll take these 4 questions and then ask the go for the next batch of questions.
Professor Mitra, you refer to 5 variables as a kind of mantra for governance and good governance or whatever you call it. So can you prioritize, if you are asked to prioritize, which would be the most preferred and which would be the least preferred? Right? This is the question. The second question is, when we refer to this stakeholders being made, the entry of the new categories, I'm reminded of 1984 John Wood volume. Rotary Church wrote that there is a artisan backward caste. They would be the last, the sandwich community he called them, and said that they would be the last to be included in the social structure of power. So what is the scenario right now in India about their inclusion? They are not rebels, they don't have the numbers, they are not really pushing for power. So this third class compartment, when their number would come, their chance would come.
Thank you very much for that reminder of all this ease for doing business and other reforms that are much appreciated by the World Bank. We have seen some nice words said about Bihar of all people, the economist. Is that all there is to development in India today? Yes and no. On the one hand, India is opening up, trying to become a normal country and going for a deal. I live in Singapore, so I see a lot of that happening. What is not happening is the trickle down of those development all the way. India is trying to do what Europe has done over 150 years, and going from here to there in Europe was not a picnic. My generation was brought up on Barrington Moore, Social Origins of Democracy and Dictatorship, Lord and Peasant in the Making of Modern Society. Moore talks about 4 big revolutions that made modern Europe: the industrial, the political, the economic, and the cultural, which also includes the religious. And in each case, modernity came by crushing the vulnerable. In Scotland, the cottagers were replaced by large pastures. One shepherd with a flock of sheep could take the jobs of 40 families. Now those people who lost their jobs, some went to the newly developing industrial centers to become cannon fodders for galloping industrialization. 18-hour days, child labor, women's labor, your hand got chopped off, don't complain, move over, the next person gets your job. That is the England of Charles Dickens, and that's how they made it. In China, between 58 and 62, 45 million people were killed because agricultural statistics was falsified and there was nothing to eat. Most died from hunger. Some were beaten to death, others were eaten. This is from Chinese sources. Now, India is trying also to go from here to there, and there are people who are falling below. Lots and lots of programs to help them out. And when you look at that in cross-national comparison, you have to give credit that this is still being done in spite of the pressure to go for rampant capitalism. So I thank you for the observation and for reminding us that in this age of neoliberal reforms and looking out for deals from the World Bank, the intellectual has a critical role to play. The intellectual has to become the critical observer and to talk about what is not happening. But the intellectual must also notice what is happening and to build on that. Howsoever you measure it, poverty in India as a whole has come down. Howsoever you measure it, I don't see stuff that I saw when I first started fieldwork, people going to bed hungry, not because they were fasting, because they didn't have anything to eat. So this is the role that we have to play, and you have reminded me of it. Maybe I should have talked a little more about that. But the reason to choose Bihar were the Naxalites. The reason to choose Bihar, Bengal, and Tripura were these were states with terrific insurgencies. And those have also come down. We have to have detailed studies, but globally speaking, there is a decline. I'm going to move on quickly so as to have a second round. Why multi-party system in India and why one party in China? Well, many people would like the kind of muscular leadership that the Chinese are providing and crushing, building new islands and basically bullying their neighbors. And when you look at India, when you look at Indian diplomats stuck as to what to do about Pakistan, what to do about the last terrorist attack, and being hemmed in, people have a little bit of envy as to why can't we do like them. The fact of the matter is the Chinese one-party system is not really just a one-party system. Underneath, there are terrific intra-party coalitions and competitions, and the political leadership tries to balance the civil and the military. And India's multi-party system, as we see more and more, is becoming rather sort of dominated by not a one-party or one dominant party system, but a fairly strong, decisive leadership. So there is a kind of convergence, I would say. To add the other questions, I've not talked much about, I've only talked about individuals competing against one another for maximizing their share, assuming that the rules of the game are fair. These last two questions talk about rules that may be basically patently unfair. And that is where the individual-driven prisoner's dilemma game breaks down. What you start is a game on the rules of the game, very complex to model, but what I've tried to do is to do it metaphorically, not analytically, to talk about how rules are co-authored by the powerful and the powerless. And that is what is happening at the local level and regional level in India. Increasingly, we find that soundings are being taken by the powerful in the making of new norms. The judiciary itself has become a third house. It's also coming in with new norms. Or in other words, if I have a hand in making of the rules, then the game becomes like a Kantian legislature where you are simultaneously the maker of the law and its slave, if I may put it metaphorically. And this is what India did when the constitution was made. It was not a popularly elected constitution at all, but it was remarkably prescient in terms of anticipating the future. Just to give one example and then I'll stop. What do you do about language? All right, you make linguistic states where you can have local language for general education. But how about Tamils living in Delhi? Do they not have a right to have their children educated in Tamil? So the state provides for Tamil schools which can be set up by groups of Tamils, and they will not be discriminated against in the giving of public health. Or for that matter, Hajj pilgrimage, and it's a secular state, but money is provided. There's a Hajj terminal for Muslims to go on Hajj. Not elected by the communities themselves, but by the government, by a government board, which accidentally has a Muslim IAS officer as its secretary. That's how the state provides rule of law in areas where individual driven laws are not possible. And the issue was pressed in the judiciary, how can a secular state give money to Muslims to go on Hajj? The answer there was, it's a cultural right of Muslims to go on Hajj. How can you deny this right to some people just because they're poor? So the reasoning here is expressing religion in terms of class. That's the kind of sophisticated work that India's political rhetoric and political logic does. Anyway, these are the various things that keep India more or less a resilient democracy. It does break down from time to time. I have one more thing to say about communal riots, but maybe I'll wait for that question to come.
Four hands. We'll start at this end. Gentleman in front of the camera.
Hello. Sir, while you were underlining the resilience of India as a democracy, I'm wondering what would you say to the kind of changes that the government is trying to bring in? For example, the new Citizenship Bill Act, like the 2016, where there are separate provisions for the people who would come from the neighboring countries, and for Muslims, it's quite exclusionary in nature. So what would you say to that? There is an attempt at to change the framework itself. Thank you.
Thank you. I really like your model. It's complex, maybe a little too complex, but it's quite a beautiful thing in many ways. I'm wondering about how small groups can get a place in this system. A group has to be fairly large, I think, to take advantage of the opportunities your system offers. And a couple of my slides, there were the OBCs, the lower OBCs at the bottom, a green line, and they don't get any seats at all. There are 265 of them, most of them very small. In Nepal, there's 47 Janajatis, of which maybe 10 are big enough to get a real place in the system. A proportional representation kind of electoral system can pick up groups, political groups, like say a Green Party that's scattered and that can't win any single member seats, but it can win a few seats with a PR system. But the Kumhars, the Sonars, all the little artisan castes and the OBCs, all the little Janajatis, how are they going to get into the system? It's a difficult question, but I wonder what your thoughts are. Thanks.
On the model first, or the early part of the model, the prisoner's dilemma bit. I mean, the problem always with prisoner's dilemma reasoning is that people play multi-period games, not single-period games. And in multi-period games, of course, they learn about each other's behaviour, and they build up predictive capacity about how the other side, as it were, is going to behave and make appropriate adjustments. And obviously, that's, if you take, say, the work of Eleanor Ostrom, you have to have a sequence of game playing which builds in the learning that the partners do in each repeated game. And it seems to me that if you take that, unfortunately, slightly more complicated approach, but what it does tell you then is that if you're looking at the relationship between elites and those who are, as it were, stakeholders, the usual title, and those who are rebels, who are going to become, or might become stakeholders, then of course you need to apply the multi-period game, because that's how the rules of the game evolve and how institutions get established in that process. So, and of course that's the background, the underpinning to the work of Douglas North and colleagues in, say, for example, the book Violence and Social Orders, which provides a model of how the natural state may move around, not teleologically, not linear, but actually move forwards and backwards along lines of fragility and so on, rather than seeing it as a linear trajectory based upon a multi-period game.
Yeah, I actually also had two questions. I think one was exactly what Professor had asked, that business dilemma in a multi-period game, you can, with repeated interactions, have strategies that can actually give cooperation as a national equilibrium, right? So how would sort of reconcile that idea? That's question number one. Question number two, you seem to suggest that consociationism as a solution towards maintaining rule of law, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on Steve Wilkinson's work, who actually shows that as India had increasing consociationism, it was also associated with actually higher violence over time. So how to sort of reconcile those two views, your view and the opposing view from Wilkinson's work. Thanks.
All right, it has been a long day. I will not go on very much at length, but these are excellent questions. I'm afraid I have not read the new Muslim citizenship law, so I can't talk about it specifically, but I have studied citizenship, and I have studied citizenship in terms of measuring citizenship, and that was something that had not been done before. I have, in a survey format, used 4 questions in vernacular, even in Kashmir. क्या आप अपने को कश्मीर भारत के शहरी मानते हैं? Do you consider yourself a नागरिक of Bharat? Do you feel your rights are respected, right to move and freedom of speech? Do you feel, from Article 51, loyal to the flag, territory, national anthem? And finally, who are non-citizens, what should be done to them? And combining the 4, I've developed a scale, and that's what I was talking about earlier. Tripura was the lowest in that scale. Very interestingly, Muslims come out not very, actually at the national average, and in some states above the national average in terms of their level of citizenship. And I was asking myself, why is that the case? Because, you're not going to like it. Muslim is a constructed category. Out there, you don't think yourself necessarily as a Muslim, but as a father, as a student, as someone who needs a job, someone whose land is not secure, someone who is not very different from others in terms of class or region. And they feel entitled to the same thing that other people do. And to the extent they are met, those needs are met, they are claiming and asserting their rights as fellow citizens. So when I talk about citizenship, I'm talking about individuals with their needs, their fears, their anxieties. And to the extent that is met, democracy becomes transactional and citizenship is assured. There is no exclusion category in terms of religion that you know. So again, Muslims, after partition, for example, did not get relegated to second-class citizenship. That's the legal position and the constitutional position. And one thing about India that the world does recognize is the number of NGOs and other agencies who are militating, who are trying hard to protect those rights. It's the middle classes who come out. And that is something that makes Indian democracy stand out. As citizenship goes, it's a fragile right. It has to be constantly watched and protected, particularly when it comes to minority communities. But then the moment you ask minority communities, who is a minority in India, the majority community comes across also as a fragile thing. It's a politically constructed category out there. To say that I am a Hindu is a political statement. Hindu as an identity is measured every 10 years when you're asked about your religion. But most of the time, you have people who identify themselves in terms of other categories. So in terms of electoral sociology, you know that there are 80 parliamentary constituencies where Muslim vote is important in terms of being decisive for winning. That again gives a sense of empowerment. And increasingly, minorities in India, Muslims for that matter, or Dalits, have understood the logic of the electoral game. And that is how their sense of empowerment comes. Then comes the case of Uttar Pradesh. How can one talk about Muslim representation when the majority party has not selected a single Muslim as a candidate? I have made the argument before in one of my interventions, and I'll make it again. Representation in India is political and not based on religion. That was the two-nation theory which India rejected. What political parties are doing is to not go for religious representation, but for winnability. The winnability is a criterion, and that is what is driving political parties. So I wouldn't think of an explicit exclusion of Muslims, but explicit concentration on winning. That said, it will become a problem if the BJP doesn't do anything about it quickly, which is to send a message they're not necessarily anti-Muslim, they just want to win a majority and keep it that way, and remind people that representation is that of interests and not of religions. Yeah, I'll move on to the... Same with OBCs. These are large categories that are given constitutional protection, but when it comes to electoral politics, these categories get routinely crushed by the creation of short-term coalition. That is what we have seen recently in UP, and that is what we have also seen in Bihar, that these large categories, which look neat constitutionally, are not at all homogeneous at the local level, and multi-caste, multiple short-term alliances break them up and recreate them in terms of newer categories. That's the balance between individual representation and group identities, and that's a dynamic process. The last question will be about stakeholders. No stakeholders, no democracy. You can't have a democracy when you have people who own nothing. So the fact that you may own a mobile phone, an Aadhaar card, an address, maybe a house, will make you a stakeholder, and when you have something to lose, you become automatically deeply conservative with a small c. You understand the status quo, and that is the top left corner of the game that I'm talking about. If you make stakeholders, then people would go towards understanding their rule and holding on to it, hoping to die in their own beds peacefully, surrounded by their loved ones, possibly with the help of a priest or the presence of a doctor. Or in other words, normal people would want a normal life if they have a stake to defend. No one knows it better than Singapore, where everyone who is a Singapore citizen can look forward to owning a flat. They might pay for it for 20 years and not complain about the right, but they have a stake, they're stakeholders. So the stakeholders democracy is where India is going towards, and that's where those that are falling through the net have to be identified and given some stakes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mitra, and thank you, all of you. And now I guess we can... We can't take any more questions, so now this particular session is over. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Just a couple of announcements. As tomorrow is the last day of the conference, we request all the speakers, the chairpersons and presenters to record your pieces to the camera for ADRI's archives. This will be done at the restaurant on the ground floor. It shouldn't take more than 4 or 5 minutes, and our team will try and accommodate and give you a time that's suitable to you. The lecture tomorrow starts at 8:35 a.m. So unlike every other day, tomorrow we start earlier at 8:35 a.m. And the first lecture is delivered by Professor Kaushik Ghosh on the shining land, Adivasiness, and the ecological imperative. Dinner is going to be served in the Lumbini Hall. Thank you.
गर्मी लग रहा है, गर्मी लग रहा है। 8:35 से पहले स्टार्ट हो। 8 बजे तक आ जाए। 8 बजे आप पहुँच जाएंगे। ठीक है ना? बोले ना। हाँ, हो सके पहला तो बोलो पहला पता ना अलग हो बोले ना। बन गया इसलिए इसमें चेंज नहीं हो सकता, पहले से बना हुआ है।